coming through. Okay, great. Apologies if the sound is a little bit difficult from my end. I'm actually at the UN Regional Forum in Africa, so apologies for some up and down on the vocals here. So it's great to welcome everyone to this very timely webinar. As Action for Sustainable Development, we've been working together very closely with CCIC, and it's fantastic to work together also with Together 2030, with Forus, with Save the Children, with ActionAid, and with many other partners to pull together this fourth edition of the Progressing National SDGs Implementation Report, which, as I hope you already know, is an independent assessment of the VNRs, the Voluntary National Reviews, and it looks at all the Voluntary National Reviews that were conducted in 2019. We have a great panel for you today. You'll be hearing from Shannon, who is the key driver to actually get this report off the ground and has done a fantastic amount of work to get us here. And she will take us through the report. We'll then also hear from Javier, who has been looking at countries that are reporting for the second time, because now we're at the end of the first cycle. There are more and more countries that are reporting for the second time. We then will hear from Ugona from the Ghana SDGs Coalition in terms of a national perspective, and then to Deirdre Devoka from Forus, who will talk us through a little bit on the HLPF reform, which is just started now. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Shannon. And again, apologies if my sound has been a bit up and down, but over to you, Shannon. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Ollie. Greatly appreciated, and welcome to all of our supporters of the Progressing National SDGs Implementation Report. I hope for some of you this is new, and for some of you, maybe you've been following along in the assessments that we've been doing for the last 3 years, followed by an assessment carried out by Bond in 2016 of the Voluntary National Review reports. And so what I'd like to do today is maybe just walk you through a bit about the report itself, and then the story as it's emerging from our review of the Voluntary National Review reports over the past 4 years. So as Ollie mentioned, the report is a civil society initiative. You know, I always flag, you know, that we're always looking for organizations that maybe want to be a part of this. And so do please feel free to use the chat box if you would like further information, that sort of thing. After the presentation, I can also, you'll also get links to the report, which is now just being posted live today. And of course, if you have questions throughout, we do have a question and answer box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen there. You can ask us any questions and we'll do our best to answer them once we finish sort of the more formal presentation points. For those of you who know the report, you'll know that we cover most aspects of SDG implementation. We look at how governments are reporting on governance and institutions, policies, the means of implementation, and how they report against the Secretary General's voluntary common reporting guidelines. So it's a fairly comprehensive report. And through this report, what we really try to do is provide an aggregate picture of, you know, the state of implementation, but we also pull out what we think are best practices coming out of the various reports that we look at, you know, and we showcase those as spotlights. We also try to give some flesh to the data by providing examples of good practice case studies. So examples of information we find in the VNR reports that we think maybe looks promising in terms of 2030 agenda implementation, noting that this information does come from VNR reports and all the challenges that we have with those in terms of their you know, the extent to which they're consultative and so on. And so we're quite upfront that this information is based on the reports alone, and where possible civil society reports that we can use to validate information. We provide a bit of a traffic light ranking in terms of how countries do on reporting against the Secretary General's common reporting guidelines. So very simple, they meet the guideline, they somewhat meet the guideline, or they don't meet the guideline at all, or include that component of the guidelines at all. And then we also prepare country profiles. And those profiles allow us to provide information, short synopses of how a country is doing against our pillars of analysis and pulling that data from the VNRs to produce those. Now, in terms of, thinking about how this report might be useful to you, as I mentioned, one of the key sort of helpful pieces is the current state of play on the 2030 agenda. The best practices that we identify, those are helpful for thinking about, what might implementation look like in your country, what might you advocate if you're on the side of civil society or academic or others, what might you advocate to your government in terms of good practice, if your government looking for what might be a good practice you want to adopt. It's quite helpful in that sense. For organizations interested in doing their own parallel reporting, the pillars of analysis that we use offer a helpful basis for thinking about what parallel reporting might look like. And of course, just having a very simple overview, a short summary of of any particular country that we provide in the annex is also quite helpful, just to get a kind of a quick look at where any given country is against the broader kind of aggregate trends that we see already. And so in terms of the sort of the story that emerges this year, and having looked at these reports now for 4 years, one of the sort of overall pieces that we noted this year is that there is an improvement in reporting against the Secretary General's common reporting guidelines. 75% of the countries that reported in 2019 included information on all the components. We saw a significant increase in reporting on leaving no one behind as a dedicated chapter or a robust section in the report. But we still see challenges in terms of reporting on structural issues, with governments not necessarily unpacking that dimension of the structural barriers that they face in implementing the agenda. We also saw a slight decline in reporting against the conclusions and reporting on the methodology for the review, which was after an increase in 2018. So that is a bit concerning, but overall, across all of the pillars of or aspects, components of analysis requested by in the Common Voluntary Reporting Guidelines, we definitely see that most countries are reporting against them. And I would have to say that, reviewing these reports this year and thinking about the previous years and what we've seen, we definitely see that leaving no one behind is becoming a defining feature of the agenda in terms of how governments report and in terms of some of the focus that we're seeing in the reports. So that manifests itself in a couple of ways. In one sense, what we see is just the reporting on leaving no one behind, up about to 81% this year versus 61% in last year. We've also seen countries recognizing that leaving no one behind is a challenge in a way that we haven't seen in previous years. When we look at what countries identify as their challenges to implementation this year, 21% noted that leaving no one behind was one of their significant challenges. And that is a change from what we saw in previous years. We also continue to see, and this is a finding from last year that continues into this year, the groups identified as at risk of being left behind. There's a clear identification of who those groups are, and you have an infographic on your screen that gives you an idea of what the reporting looked like this year for groups. But what we also found is still continued nuance. So yes, you have these, kind of broader categories of groups, but you also have states talking about children with a disability or intersectional components of, thinking about who is being left behind, and that being articulated in some of the reports as well. With that being said, in that context, still the need for disaggregated data, particularly around gender, age, but also other aspects of disaggregated data is a challenge around the leaving no one behind agenda, and that continues to be an issue. One of the pieces that does emerge, however, is still a question mark, I think, for us, is the extent to which leaving no one behind, while it's included in the VNR reports, the extent to which that is a defining feature of the overall approach or has been integrated into overall development plans. And so in that respect, we only saw 36% of the countries that reported talking about how they had embedded leaving no one behind or addressing inequality and social exclusion in their overarching development plans. And I think for me, there's still this risk of, essentially reporting on what a country is already doing, rather than demonstrating that they've taken effective steps to really change their approach in light of the leaving no one behind agenda. Another so that's sort of the leaving no one behind piece. But the other sort of area that the report really looks at is around sort of a whole of society approach, or inclusion around stakeholder engagement, those kinds of things. And one of the really clear findings for me is that it is emerging as a standard practice to include non-state actors in the governance arrangements. So whether these are councils or working level committees, but essentially the institutional arrangements for 2030 agenda implementation. And I would argue that it will be increasingly difficult for governments to justify not doing that when the majority of governments are certainly taking that approach. And so I think, and we see this kind of emerging across the 4 years that we've looked at. Perhaps one of the concerns in this context, however, is that in 2019, the focus of that engagement moved towards more of the technical working group level, where governments have struck working groups on different issues, and they're including non-state actors there, versus the kind of broader, higher level, more strategic councils or committees that oversee 2030 agenda implementation. So that's definitely a cause for concern in this year's findings, particularly as that's now a decrease over 2018, where we saw a greater focus on the higher level committees and councils. So, of course, engagement isn't only about the governing institutions. It's also about formal mechanisms or processes of stakeholder engagement that can allow for broader engagement beyond just the councils themselves, or the more kind of formal governance arrangements. And in 2019, we saw an increase of the number of countries talking about formal processes of stakeholder engagement. We saw an increase in countries reporting on directly including non-state actors in the actual VNR drafting process. So beyond consultations to prepare VNRs or online validation processes, but actually submitting chapters or involved in drafting teams and committees and that sort of thing. And in terms of the other kind of formal processes of stakeholder engagement, we saw some countries talking about preparing, and I would say a handful, talking about having prepared policies, engagement policies, communication strategies, a formal annual event, youth councils, those kinds of mechanisms emerging. But that being said, we still have very little information on the quality of engagement. And so we flag again in this year's report that still very much matters, and our kind of 5 principles for what that means and what that looks like: timely, open, transparent, informed, and iterative engagement. And along the lines of sort of a whole of society approach, we are also seeing that countries are, increasingly presenting what we think of as national VNR reports. So reports that are showcasing, the contributions by non-state actors in those reports. We saw overall most countries referred to the actions of non-state actors in their reporting, but we also saw that, that while there was increases in reporting around civil society in their role, we saw declines in reporting on academic contributions, on the contributions of the private sector, on parliamentarians, and so on. And so there's certainly room to improve in the extent to which the VNR reports are showcasing a whole of society approach. And I suppose the other major piece to flag is that, countries do not tend to report on closing civic space. We know that this is a big issue. We know that there's increasing attacks on environmentalists, on human rights defenders, on others. And reports are silent on this. So on one hand, we're seeing, increasing engagement in governance institutions, more reporting on formal stakeholder engagement, but yet, a lack of recognition of closing civic space, and lack of recognition of what that means for this agenda. And so we very much highlight our concern around, sort of the continued silence on that issue in the reporting. In terms of the policies, most countries do report that they have in some way assessed policies or data this year, and that informs their overall approach. This year there was more of a focus on policies than there was on data, but regardless, we do see that as an emerging kind of standard practice. It'll be interesting to see what happens in second-time reporters. And how that piece of information will continue to inform the policies as we move forward. But most countries have certainly described integrating the SDGs into national policies and frameworks, and that they provided also information on the level of data that they have available to monitor and evaluate. In this context, though, we still see less of a focus on the transformative elements of the 2030 agenda. This chart that you have on your screen is an example around, the extent to which countries referred to a human rights-based approach, intergenerational responsibility, leaving no one behind, and so on in their reports. And as you can see, aside from leaving no one behind, which is commonly referred to, there's gaps certainly in countries reporting on or even referencing these other transformative principles of the 2030 agenda. We also found this year some backtracking on the extent to which countries cover all aspects of 2030 agenda implementation consistently in their reporting. With a lot of countries having a greater focus on one or another element of the sustainable dimensions of whether the economy, society, the environment. Overall, where countries didn't refer to all aspects of sustainable development equally, they tended to bias towards social issues. And then in terms of the means of implementation, this year there was definitely an increased, reference in the VNR reports around incorporating the SDGs into budgeting processes or plans to incorporate the SDGs into budgeting processes, which I think is a good sign. It was interesting in that most countries identify as their key challenge to implementation finance and resources, or resource mobilization as one of the key challenges. It's the most commonly cited one, but yet, and countries identify the sources of finance for the most part, public expenditures, private sector investment, and so on. But they have not necessarily costed out 2030 agenda implementation. And so we know it costs a lot. We know that there needs to be sources of finance. We know that it's being integrated into budgeting, but what the actual cost is and what the actual level of resources needed are is not necessarily presented. One of the things that we've highlighted over the years has been the extent to which countries have reported on different aspects of the learning elements related to the high-level political forum and the voluntary national reviews. So reporting on what they see as their best practices, their lessons learned, their challenges, and so on. And what they want to learn from peers. And what we see this year is that there's been, there's relatively good reporting on the challenges, on issues related to good practices, or lessons learned rather, but with good practices, with peer learning, we're seeing declines in reporting, and some concern around that. If the high-level political forum is going to be the space where we're able to have that peer learning and exchange, then we need to make sure we're reporting on some of these critical aspects of implementation. And finally, around follow-up and review. So it was interesting this year because most countries provided information on follow-up and review. They provided the information on data availability in a way that we hadn't seen in the past, but yet actual accountability mechanisms, references to the role of Parliament, of supreme auditing institutions, of how, these reports, who will be reported to and when, so details around reporting. We found a lot of gaps in that space that were cause for concern. Also limited references to the regional moments that might exist for peer learning and exchange or reporting on progress, as well as the high-level political forum and how that features into, the accountability, the follow-up and review process. So sort of a weird finding in a sense that we have more information, but yet somehow less detailed information in terms of the reporting on this dynamic this year. So that's a very brief overview of the report. I'll now turn it back over to Ollie to provide an opportunity for our commenters to offer their reflections.
Thanks so much, Shannon, and hopefully my connection is a little bit more stable now. I just wanted to quickly comment. Now, Shannon, you had shared with me, and apologies, I didn't share this earlier, the profile of people on the call. So we have a pretty diverse call today from every continent, including quite a large number from the Americas, from Africa, from Europe, as well as from Asia and the Pacific area. You are mainly from civil society groups, although we understand there are also some from international organizations and also interest from government. So it's great to have that interest. And we've had similar conversations here at the Africa Regional Forum with a number of governments that are taking a real interest now. We also understand that many of those on the call did have a VNR last year, but there are also quite a few of you having a VNR this year. So that gives us a bit of a sense of who's on the call. And again, just to reiterate, we're using the chat function for questions, and I can see some questions are starting to come in already. So that's just a little bit more background. And now over to Javier on the second-time reporters. Javier, are you there?
Yes, Ali, I'm here. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to share with all of you our main findings related to particularly the second reporters. And I should start by saying that the second reports issue is not only of interest for countries that are presenting by the second time their VNRs in the HLPF, but also it is an important issue for countries presenting by the first time, because one of the findings that we have in our report is that it's almost impossible to build a good second VNR, a concrete second VNR, if you didn't started providing the requested information in your first presentation. What this means? This means that the second report only could be a real contribution to the HLPF if it's right and if it's synced in a cycle perspective. And you should start the cycle perspective logic in your reporting exercise since the very beginning. Taking into account that the number of second and even third reports is rising, as it's obvious because countries are coming back to the HLPF with new information. Our work shows that countries are failing in their reports in present clear future steps to be followed. So second reporters doesn't have a concrete basis to start reporting any progress, because if you didn't manage to be clear and to establish clear future steps in your first presentation, so you cannot continue, you cannot show the process that you are going through to implement the 2030 agenda. That means that second reporters or second VNRs becomes a second first VNR. They're showing photographs of the moments in which country is going to the HLPF to present their progress, but we cannot find any clue about the process that the countries are following. That means that it's very hard to find the traceability on progress, stagnations, or setbacks in the way that countries are following. And even more complicated is try to identify the causes of those progress, stagnations, or setbacks. Another important thing to underline is that second reporters are not being clear on the process of and the and on progress related to integrate silos in favor of an integrated approach to sustainable development. And also, second reporters are failing in provide inputs generated at the regional and local levels in their reports, inputs that should came from as a result. Sorry, inputs that should came as a result of the presentations of the first reports. Of course, all these facts are general facts, and we have some particular cases that are really good examples on what we should expect from a second report. But in general way, we should say that the second report doesn't differ for the first one. And maybe this is the greatest problems that we are finding, because they're working out of cycles, as I said, and they are not providing enough elements to know how the process is evolving in each country. Out of that, second reports are very close to the first ones in issues like multi-stakeholder involvement or any other that we analyzed across our report. The main difference is that we could expect from second reports to know more and know deeper the reasons that are or the obstacles, I mean, the obstacles and progress that the countries are facing. And in fact, that's not the case. As I said, second reports seems to be a repetition than the first reports. And last but not least, I want also to say that it's not clear why countries are choosing the time to present the second reports. One of the things that we find is that second report presentations should be made only when reporting countries consider that the changes in the results or the information available on progress are sufficient enough to come back to the HLPF. And again, the situation is not clear about this. The second reporters are not clear on why they took the decision to come back in this moment. And in fact, we are seeing that countries are presenting their second and even third report with only 2 years difference between the first and second, and in 2 years is not enough time to identify the real changes that occurs in a slow pace, and that are the kind of changes that the 2030 agenda implementation needs. So we find that it's also it's also lack of information on the reasons behind second and third presentations. So there is a lot to improve in second reporters, and as a main conclusion, I should say that second reporters doesn't differ for first reporters in their contents or in its logic, and this should change if we want to have real information about processes that are taking place in countries towards SDGs implementation. So thank you very much, and I'm back to Oli.
Thanks, Javier. That was an extremely useful analysis, and indeed the question of how countries show real progress from one VNR to the next is a key question, particularly now that we open the second cycle of reporting. So thanks for that analysis. I think on the program now we turn to Deirdre from Chorus. Deirdre, would you be able to give us a bit of an update on where things stand with the HLPF review and some of the key priorities for civil society there?
Sure, thanks a lot, Ollie, and hope you're enjoying the regional forum there in Zimbabwe. Hello, everybody. My name is Deirdre de Burke. I'm the advocacy coordinator with Forus, which is a global civil society network. And I'm going to be just speaking a little bit about the high-level political forum review and its connection to some of the great recommendations that are coming out of this report here today. So obviously Forus has been involved in contributing to this report over the last 3 years. And what's really good about the report, and Shannon has highlighted that, is that it identifies and promotes best practice in national SDG implementation, as well as highlighting gaps and challenges. And so a very important opportunity is going to happen this year, which might allow for a lot of the recommendations of this report and of previous reports to influence the way in which the high-level political forum functions. And that's the high-level political forum review process that's taking place this year. So the high-level political forum, as everybody here knows, is the central space for following up and reviewing the UN member states' SDG implementation. But the founding resolution of the high-level political forum mandated governments to review the functioning of the high-level political forum every 4 years. So that happened in 2019, a formal review of the high-level political forum was to take place. So it has kicked off. There are 2 co-chairs for the process. Benin is one of the co-chairs and Georgia is the other. And they had their first meeting recently on the 10th of February. And they will be looking both at the review process of the UN Economic and Social Council, or ECOSOC as we know it, and also the HLPF. So civil society, including my own network Forus, has been very active on producing, on both advocating and developing proposals for the reform of the HLPF. And the members of Forus are 69 national NGO platforms in every region of the world and 7 regional coalitions. So really lots of experience from all over the world in what it's like to try to implement the SDGs at national level. So in consultation with our members, Forus developed our own advocacy document on the HLPF review. And I'm just going to share a few of those key proposals today. So the key proposal, or one of the key proposals we made, was that the high-level political forum review process must be ambitious and not just be a superficial tweaking of existing arrangements. We also made the proposal that the review should not just focus on the global level, because we all know what happens at the high-level political forum happens in the New York bubble, as many people call it, but it's often difficult to see its relevance for the national level. So we've called for this review of the high-level political forum to be multi-level, and that will mean including reforms to the follow-up and review processes at the regional and national levels, the VNR processes and those links to the regional sustainable development forums. We've also called for the review, the high-level political forum review, to greatly strengthen the multi-stakeholder dimension of the HLPF, particularly the involvement of civil society as a key stakeholder. And this is really important because even though we hear a lot of very positive official talk about the role of civil society and multi-stakeholder engagement, how key that is to the success of SDG implementation, the high-level political forum still remains largely a state-centered and state-driven process. And civil society and other key stakeholders remain very marginal, or really on the sidelines in terms of their involvement in the high-level political forum. So just as an example, no official status is given to consolidated CSO alternative reports or shadow reports or spotlight reports within the overall HLPF cycle. And there's no opportunity for discussion of the content of these reports at the high-level political forum. So this obviously needs to change. The presentation of the VNRs during the high-level political forum as well must be given more time. And this is a key proposal of many civil society advocacy around the review. So VNRs are an opportunity for national assessments of progress and also for effective stakeholder engagement. But the current approach to the presentation of the VNRs really is very flawed because it only allows 3 ministerial days during the high-level political forum for the presentation of between 40 to 50 VNRs. And the result is that the presentation of each VNR is only allocated about 15 minutes per country, and that gives very little opportunity for constructive dialogue. So we're proposing that to make the VNRs more effective, there has to be better presentations, more time, more learning, more openness, and more involvement of civil society and other stakeholders. Now already there are what are called VNR labs that are run around at the time of the HLPF. They're very useful. They help different stakeholders to come together to discuss issues around the VNRs. But we're definitely suggesting that more time is needed and that perhaps a side event could be scheduled linked to every VNR that's presented to allow for more dialogue between government and other stakeholders. It's even been proposed that the full 8 days of the high-level political forum could be devoted to VNR presentations. And all of these ideas, we believe, must be explored to make this important part of the HLPF linked to the VNRs more effective. Another policy proposal we've made in the review is that the high-level political forum needs to become more policy-oriented. So we believe the activities of the high-level political forum should go beyond review. And of course, review activities are very important, but we believe that space needs to be created as well for more in-depth policy discussion, and that UN member states should be supported in accessing clear policy guidance and support in target setting so that they can achieve greater sustainability across different policy areas at national levels. And the final proposal that I'll share today is one that links to one of the points that Shannon made earlier about the fact that the VNRs that are being submitted tend to neglect in the last year or so finance and resource mobilization. They don't tend to deal with those very much. So what we're calling for in our proposal is a specific multi-stakeholder mechanism for the annual review of Goal 17 implementation, because these issues fall within the means of implementation of Goal 17. So the high-level political forum should consider Goal 17 of the SDGs every year. And it's a very important goal, Goal 17. It covers capacity building, finance, multi-stakeholder partnerships, science, technology, trade. So a regular review would make sure that these areas receive the political attention they deserve. But no specific mechanism has been agreed within the framework of the high-level political forum to make sure that this annual review of Goal 17 by governments is effective. So we're calling for a specific Goal 17 review mechanism to be established by the high-level political forum and for the major groups and other stakeholders to be involved in this. And as we know, major groups and other stakeholders involve many different stakeholders, but including civil society, and we want them to be included in this new Goal 17 mechanism also. So we've made a wide range of proposals for the HLPF review. I've presented some of the key ones, but if you're interested in finding out more, please do check our Forest advocacy paper on the HLPF review, which is on our website, www.forestinternational.org. So thanks very much for listening to me today, and I look forward to taking any questions or comments if you have them. Thank you. Back to you, Ollie.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. Excellent points. And yes, particularly the point around connecting with the regional and national levels. And that's really why I'm here at the regional forum in Zimbabwe, is to try to promote that closer integration. And we're looking forward to working closely with many of our partners, and we're delighted that we also have a national perspective, because I think, as Deirdre has highlighted, it's really important that we make a much closer connection from the national through to the regional and the global level. So Ugonna Ukagwe has joined us from the National Coalition CSO Platform on Sustainable Development Goals from Ghana. Ugonna, hopefully you can come online now. Over to you. I think you should be able
Everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, great. So it's quite interesting to hear Deirdre. I got her name correctly, I hope. It's interesting to hear her speak about the recommendations that they have made to the HLPF. I think it's quite interesting. One of the things we have talked about following our VNR process is the need for the process to be done annually and not only when Ghana is reporting. And so if you had read the report from Ghana, you would see that it was quite a robust exercise. The process was very inclusive, open, adopted a very multi-stakeholder approach. There were a series of engagement with various stakeholders. In fact, the report focused on 3 cross-cutting themes, which is children and youth engagement, leaving no one behind, and synergies among the goals. And so there was a robust effort to ensure the views of stakeholders at the national and the sub-national levels were captured. There was a series of engagements with school children, market women, fisher folks, lorry drivers, and what have you. And it's some of the key lessons from that process is that if we are to sort of institutionalize this process, we don't have to do this massive engagement only when Ghana is reporting, at the HLPF. Is there a way we can, ensure that stakeholders are part of this process on an annual basis? We also, from that process, learned that there's a lot of work to be done at the local level. People really don't understand when we talk about the SDGs, when we talk about what the role of government is in the process, what are their own contributions, what the civil society advocacy around the SDGs should be like. So those are some of the things we found when we did the regional awareness process in the lead up to the VNR. We also saw that at the local level, the coordination is very weak. At the national level, for example, we already have the process institutionalized. We have a coordinating committee, that coordinates the implementation process. But this is lacking at the subnational level. When you go to the local government, civil society engagement is very weak. Public institutions and the municipal assemblies are not even clear. Some of them don't even know what the direction is in terms of the implementation. So that's one of the challenges we saw. Also, we noticed that we are making a proposal, for example, to local government to see how they can set up a similar structure, the same implementation coordinating committee as we have it at the national level, which will have civil society, private sector as part of the implementation process. I understand that at the national level, the government is currently developing a blueprint for this coordination to happen. So we want to see more robust engagement at the subnational level, which is currently lacking. Again, I think this is also across board, the issue of data. You can hardly find, reliable and timely data that is properly, disaggregated at all levels, especially at the subnational level. And so if you are talking about monitoring and reporting, the data at the local level, you can't even use it to make, proper decision. So capacity levels are very weak at the subnational level. And those are the things that we saw when we were doing the VNR process. And that's why we're suggesting that this has to be done annually. We can't wait for, okay, so if Ghana is not reporting this year, then people are not engaged. People don't know what is happening. How are they involved in the process? Yeah, so thank you.
Thanks so much, Ugonna. Great to have you on the call. And yes, absolutely, a number of those points have also been raised with some of the governments present here at the Africa Regional Forum. Zimbabwe, as the host here, was highlighting the importance of going to the local level. And in fact, the Ministry for Local Planning has been encouraging all of the local administrations in Zimbabwe to consider this. So it's clearly on the agenda, and I can see there's also a question on that. There's not very much time left, I'm afraid, so we're going to have to just take the 2 or 3 questions that have come through already, and I'd like to direct them primarily to Shannon. The first question here is around, do we know the degree to which these assessments were funded by government or by external donors? And then there's a question around the local agenda that we just mentioned and ensuring voluntary local reviews as well. And then finally, we've just had a question coming in from the Commonwealth. Is there a connection with the Commonwealth here? I might be able to answer that one if you can't chat, but I'll come to you first.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Ollie, for that. Okay, so on the first question about the policies, like data assessments, policy assessments, that kind of thing, and whether that's funded externally or by the governments, I would say that generally speaking, it's only clear that there's been external support when the countries used the Rapid Integrated Assessment of the United Nations Development Program. And the odd occasion, a report will also refer to support of donors or of partners, but it's not always very clear. We had 9 countries last year that referred to the Rapid Integrated Assessment. It's shown in the report. Also, just to flag that in terms of more broadly development partner support, it is one of the things we look at under partnership. And last year, 38 of the 47 countries, the question of international partnerships with donors in particular was relevant, and of those 66%, so 25 of those reports referred to the role of development partners and the kind of support that they would need to implement the 2030 agenda. On the local aspects of the agenda, we don't look at the local voluntary reviews, but what we do is look at the question of localization within the reports. And so there's a couple of things that we provide information on this year. One is around sort of a picture of what localization efforts are noted in the VNR reports, and we've categorized that according to sort of increasing levels of participation in 2030 agenda implementation, sort of starting at the low bar, which is including local governments in national consultations and VNR preparations, through to what I would consider kind of the end state or higher level of integration, where you've locally led initiatives and activities to realize the SDGs, it's embedded in policies and so on. And in that context, we did note an increase in the number of countries that reported that the 2030 agenda had been integrated into local plans and policies. Or would be integrated. So 13 countries said that it had already been done, and 5 said that they plan to do so. So we had 18 countries in total, which compares to about 16 in 2018. But in that case, we had a larger proportion who were still planning to integrate into national plans, or local plans rather, and a smaller portion that had already done so. So we saw a bit of a shift, roughly the same number or percentage of countries reporting on that, the integration into local plans, but more saying they had done so this year than planning to do so in previous years. Ollie, I'll let you take the question on the Commonwealth, but maybe just one point to say is that there's the odd VNR report that does talk about their engagement in the Commonwealth and sometimes initiatives or of related to the Commonwealth organizations and countries, but I wouldn't say it's a prevalent piece in the VNR reporting that we've looked at so far. And Ollie, maybe you have something you'd like to add.
So on the question of the Commonwealth, as Shannon says, it's not strictly within this report, but I have been aware that a number of the Commonwealth agencies, particularly the Commonwealth Foundation, take quite a strong interest in the SDGs, and they have looked at how they might integrate the SDG principles into their own program. And I think that's something that hopefully will become even stronger in coming years. Many of the NGOs active around the so-called CHOGM, the meeting of the heads of state, have pushed for the SDGs, and particularly Goal 16, and the question of the rule of law and governance as a key principle in the Commonwealth process as well. So for anyone who's interested in that, we can certainly link you up with the relevant people there. But at this stage, I would like to just highlight one particular point that Deirdre raised earlier, which is around the HLPF review or the HLPF reform. We are now, as Deirdre says, into the process, the official process for the review, given that the first 4-year cycle is closed. The co-chairs are already seeking inputs, and we have highlighted, Deirdre highlighted some of the joint recommendations that we collectively as civil society are pushing for. And it would be great if those of you who are interested and are active on these issues, if you want to join us over the coming weeks, please do get in touch. There will be a series of moments for advocacy, and it will happen fairly quickly, I think, over the next couple of months. This is also on this call, who's very close, and others who have been working hard on these recommendations. So please do get in touch with us following the call if you want to feed in and been on the call. Okay, sorry, I just thought I heard something. So just to thank everyone who's joined the call, and to highlight that yeah, we'll be continuing on this journey together, and we hope to see many of you in New York. Hopefully you can see, let me see if I can show you briefly the view, which is quite a nice spot, and look forward to seeing many of you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.